Good afternoon, everyone. This is Catrina Peters with the Nevada Department of Agriculture. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Our topic today is offer versus serve. We are recording the webinar this afternoon, and we'll stop the recording before question and answer. So to go over today's agenda very briefly, to discuss a little bit of housekeeping, if you have a question, go ahead and type that into the question box that you should be able to see on your toolbar. That'll allow it'll allow me to see the question, and once you type that in, I'll answer it verbally, and then we'll also have a record of the questions in case we need to clarify things after the webinar. The slides will also be posted in SlideShare, and the recording of the webinar will be available on YouTube, and we'll send out an email with the links to those two resources after the webinar. We used to send out slides, the actual PowerPoint file, but they tend to be rather large files, and we find that it's easier to post it on our website. If you did want a copy of the slides, though, please let us know and we can email those to you. So today we're going to discuss some of the meal pattern basics, just to sort of warm everybody up. Then we'll go ahead and discuss lunch, offer versus serve requirements, and we're going to give several examples, and we'll also put those to the audience so that you can try your hand at whether or not those are reimbursable meals. Then we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about the breakfast offer versus serve requirements since they're a little bit different. And we'll also go through a series of photos, and through the poll function you'll be able to test out your knowledge on whether or not it's a reimbursable meal. And finally, the last slide, we have some resources and links to those resources that we'll share with you. Okay, so when we're thinking about offer versus serve success, there's really two main steps involved. And the first step really resides with the menu planner. So keeping the number of types of items within components consistent can help site staff easily identify what a reimbursable meal is. Also, extra items that are non-creditable on the menu can make component counting slightly more difficult. So putting things on the menu like a pudding cup or potato chips, there's a possibility you could fit those in the menu, but understand that those extra items may make counting components a little more difficult for site staff. The second step is going to be training site staff and students so they understand what constitutes a reimbursable meal. And we can provide some resources to help train staff, and we find that students typically learn pretty quick with some signage that makes things clear, and also with some guidance from site staff. Okay, so to talk about the lunch menu requirements, as I'm sure you all know, all 5 food components must be offered at lunch. If you're using multiple food lines, every line must offer students all 5 food components. So we just want to really reinforce that no matter how you structure it, all 5 components need to be available to students. And at the senior high school level, offer versus serve is required for lunch. Offer versus serve is optional for junior high, middle, and elementary schools, and it's optional for all grades at breakfast. So to talk about our 5 components really briefly, the first is meat or meat alternates. The second is grains. Then we have fruits, vegetables, and of course fluid milk. So we've covered the 5 components that have to be offered. Now we'd like to talk a little bit about what can students decline. So the basic requirement of offer versus serve is that students are allowed to decline 2 of the 5 required food components, which means that they must take 3 components, and one of those components has to be a half cup of a fruit or a vegetable. And we often have folks ask, how do I communicate this to students? So we have 2 examples here. The first, you could tell students, choose 3 or more. One must be a fruit or vegetable. Another possibility, choose at least 3. One must be a fruit or veggie. We often get the question, is this the same as the number of items a student must take? The answer is no. Number of items is not the same as number of components. So components are that meat, grain, fruit, vegetable, or milk. And if non-creditable items are on the menu, like a pudding cup or potato chips, they don't count towards the 3 components. They do, of course, still count towards all the dietary specifications like calories and sodium. Okay, what about choices between components? So sometimes folks get offer versus serve confused with offering students choices between components, which are not the same thing. So if you offered students the choice of a pizza or burrito, but they must take all other components offered, this is not offer versus serve. If you were serving students a burrito, milk, a vegetable, and they had a choice of fresh fruit from a fruit bowl, but they must take a fruit, that would not be offer versus serve either. So choice between components can be a great way to increase what students consume, but we just want to make sure folks understand that offering choices between components is not the same as offer versus serve. You can, however, do both offer versus serve and offer choices. So you can combine the 2. And the example we have here is that if students had a choice of pizza or a burrito, and both those options offered hypothetically the minimum amount of meat and grain, and then you also menued baby carrots or corn, a choice of fresh fruit, and a choice of milk, there's a lot of possibilities there for students to take a reimbursable meal. And they'd only need to take 3 of the 5 components. So that could mean that they took pizza and fruit, that pizza again being 2 components plus the fruit meeting that minimum fruit or vegetable requirement. They could take the other entree available, the burrito, that hypothetically meets both the meat and grain, and then pick corn, which would meet that half cup requirement of fruit or vegetable. They could choose pizza, corn, and milk. They could also choose fruit, corn, and milk. So that would meet 3 components. Next, to talk a little bit about portion size. So there is a requirement that if the meat or grain component is offered in 2 different food items to meet the minimum quantity, the component can only be credited towards the 3 out of 5 minimum if the student selects the required daily minimum quantity for their grade group. So where this gets particularly tricky is with the high school and their requirement to be offered at least 2 ounce equivalent of meat and 2 ounce equivalent of grain. So the example we have here is that if a pizza slice, which in this situation is credited as a 1.5 ounce meat or meat alternate, is offered with a cheese stick, and that cheese stick being a 1 ounce equivalent of meat or meat alternate, both items would need to be taken for the meat alternate to count as one component. So again, where this gets particularly tricky is if you're offering a meat or a grain in a menu item that doesn't meet the minimum quantity. We also have a grain example. So if you offered students a half cup of pasta, which is 1 ounce equivalent of grain, along with a breadstick that was a 1 ounce equivalent of grain, in a high school setting, both of these items would need to be taken to count as one component. So if a student selected to just take a breadstick, that wouldn't count towards that minimum 3 out of 5 component. Okay, let's talk a little more about that half cup of fruit or vegetable. So we've often gotten the question, can it be a combination of 2 vegetable subgroups? And the answer is yes, it can be a combination of 2 vegetable subgroups. It can also be a combination of a fruit and vegetable. So this could be something like a carrot raisin salad that was a combination of fruit and vegetable. If serving sizes were small enough, it could also be that students were taking a 1/4 cup of fruit and a 1/4 cup of vegetable to meet that half cup requirement. What about signage? So students must be able to identify what constitutes a reimbursable meal, and this needs to be at or near the serving line. And you're still required to have signage even if you aren't implementing offer versus serve. So there's a couple ways to get at this, and we're open to being flexible on this. We also sent out menu boards for free, so districts could utilize that free option if they choose to. And there's sort of multiple goals behind this. And one is for offer versus serve purposes, making sure students understand what they need to take for a reimbursable meal. And also so that students who want to take a reimbursable meal understand how to do that without being charged for additional items or a la carte foods. So for offer versus serve, it needs to be clear what components or menu items they need to take, and then also clear what items are a la carte versus what items are available with the reimbursable meal. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and turn it over to the audience to test your knowledge. So we're going to go through a series of question and answer, and we'll show you a tray, and then we're going to poll you as to whether or not it's a reimbursable meal. Okay, so here's our first meal. We're putting this tray in a K through 5 setting, so think about those minimum quantity requirements. And on this tray, we see a cup of milk, 1 ounce meat and 1 ounce grain in a mac and cheese entree, an apple, and 3/4 of a cup of carrots. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll, and if folks want to vote yes or no as to whether or not this is a reimbursable meal. Okay, just about everybody's answered. Let's see if I can get it to display the answer. Okay, so 94% of you answered yes, which is the correct answer. This would be a reimbursable meal. So when we look at this tray, it has at least 3 components. They've got a milk, they've got a meat, a grain, apple, and vegetable. So they actually have all 5 components there on that tray. Okay, moving on to our next example. Again, we're still looking at a K through 5 setting, and on this tray we see a 1/2 cup of carrots, a 1 ounce of string cheese, and a 1/2 cup of salad. So everyone take a look at that tray, and we'll go ahead and launch another poll. So now you can vote yes or no if this constitutes a reimbursable meal. All right, just about everybody's voted, so we'll close our poll. And the majority of you are correct. This would not be a reimbursable meal. We'll go ahead and look at the tray again and discuss why that is. Okay, so looking at this tray, it only has two components. So the only components on this tray are a vegetable and a meat or meat alternate, which doesn't meet that minimum requirement of there being 3 components on the tray. So this one's a little tricky because there's 3 items, but only 2 components. Okay, let's look at our next example. So on this tray, we're still thinking about a K through 5, and we've got a cup of milk. We've got a sandwich that's a 1 ounce equivalent of meat and a 1 ounce equivalent of grain. We've got a half cup of pear and a half cup of broccoli. So take a look at that tray and we'll launch a poll. So now you should be able to vote as to whether or not this is a reimbursable meal. All right, just about everybody's voted, so we'll close. Share our results. And everyone got this correct. This is in fact a reimbursable meal. Fantastic job. So looking at this tray again, we have at least 3 components. We've actually got all 5 components on this tray, and at least one is at minimum half cup fruit or vegetable. Now, if this was a high school, we'd need to consider some other factors here. So knowing that in that high school setting, those grades 9 through 12, there's a minimum quantity of at least 2 ounce equivalent of meat and 2 ounce equivalent of grain, this half sandwich wouldn't meet the minimum quantity of either. So if this were a high school setting, neither of those components would count. And when we have a situation where the 3 components are a fruit, a vegetable, and a milk, between the fruit and vegetable, at least one has to be a full serving. So when we're thinking about high school and whether or not that's a reimbursable meal, we've got multiple factors involved. So we need to think about minimum quantity of components and then possibly do a little bit of different math in looking at the number of components in minimum quantity on the tray. Okay, we've got another example here. We're again looking at a K through 5 meal, and we've got carrots, an apple, chicken nuggets, a breadstick, milk, and some baked French fries. So we'll go ahead and open up the poll. So you can go ahead and vote as to whether or not you think this is a reimbursable meal. Okay, we've got just about everybody in, so we'll go ahead and close it. Share the results, and everyone got this correct. This is in fact a reimbursable meal. So again, we have at least 3 components here, and we've actually got all 5, and at least one is that half cup fruit or vegetable, so this would in fact be a reimbursable meal. If this were a high school meal, again, we'd need to maybe do a little bit different math. So in looking at that chicken nugget portion and that breadstick portion, Those may or may not meet that minimum quantity, so we need to be sure and do that math and factor in whether or not we were meeting minimum quantity. But in looking at the vegetable offered, that would likely meet a full portion. And then, of course, we have our fruit component and our milk. So in a high school, depending on the quantity of that meat and grain, this would likely be a reimbursable meal as well. Okay, we've got another tray here, and I think this is our last one. And we've got tortilla chips and some broccoli. So we will go ahead and open another poll for folks to vote. So if you want to go ahead and say yes or no, whether or not you think this is a reimbursable meal. All right, we've got just about everybody voting. And everyone got this correct as well. No, this is not a reimbursable meal. So in looking at the tray, we only have two components represented here. We just have a grain and a vegetable. So this one would definitely not be a reimbursable meal. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and switch gears and talk about breakfast. So to go over some basics, offer versus serve at breakfast is optional for all age and grade groups. At least 4 food items have to be offered. And a food item is a specific food offered within a component. And we'll talk about the 3 components required. But in this particular example, we have a menu offered of a blueberry muffin, apple slices, orange juice, and milk. So for the 3 components, we have those here. We've got blueberry muffin, which is our grain. We've got apple slices and our orange juice, which are going to be our fruit. And then we have our milk. In thinking about those 3 components, again, that's that grain, fruit, and milk. This year, a cup of fruit has to be offered, and for offer versus serve, students have to take at least a half cup of fruit. So this is a switch from last year. I know some folks were already doing that last year, but this year it's in effect for everyone. And also the minimum quantities of each component must be offered. So in looking at those 3 components, the first being grain, for all 3 grade groups, there's a 1 ounce daily minimum requirement. But when we look at the weekly amount of grains, it's different between the 3 grade groups. So for the K through 5, we have to have a 7 ounce equivalent minimum offering. And this is based on a 5-day week. For those of you that are on 4-day, that math will be just a little different. For 6 through 8, it's an 8 ounce equivalent minimum weekly. Grades 9 through 12, there's a 9 ounce equivalent minimum. So what this means is, especially in the 9 through 12 age grade group, even though a 1 ounce is the daily minimum, with the exception of 1 day, you're going to need to serve at least a 2 ounce equivalent to get to that weekly minimum. So while the daily minimum is only 1 ounce equivalent, over the week you still have to get to that 9 ounce equivalent. In looking at fruit, again, there's a 1 cup minimum daily offering for all 3 grade groups, and that math's pretty straightforward. That's 5 cups a week. And milk is really easy for breakfast and lunch. It's 1 cup for everybody every day. And for milk, of course, at breakfast, we still want to be offering those 2 varieties. So that can be a flavored or unflavored non-fat or an unflavored 1%. And in thinking about how juice might fit into this as well, full strength 100% fruit juice could be offered to meet no more than half of the weekly fruit offerings. So for a 5-day week, if every day you offered a half cup of fruit and a 4 ounce serving of juice, that would put you right at 50%, which would be allowable. If every day you were serving a half cup of fruit and a 6 ounce juice, that would put you over that 50% minimum. So the serving size is going to be really important. What about vegetables? So vegetable or vegetable juice can be substituted for fruit or fruit juice, but there's a few special circumstances that have to be met first. And one of those is that if you're going to serve a starchy vegetable, your other subgroup minimum quantity must be met. And that means that you have to serve at least 2 cups from the other vegetable subgroups in order to be able to serve that starchy. So if you wanted to serve a hash brown, you need at least 2 cups from the subgroups, and that can be things like salsa with a breakfast burrito. It could be black beans in a breakfast burrito. It could be some bell pepper in a frittata or an omelet or an egg sandwich. And vegetable juice can count for that as well. So if you're a little bit creative and look at your week total, it is possible to work something like a hash brown in that week, but you'll have to be pretty cautious with your menu planning for that. What about substituting meat or meat alternates? So you can substitute a meat or meat alternate at breakfast for a grain. However, you still have to offer at least 1 ounce equivalent of grain every day, no matter the age grade group. So that could be something like offering toast and a string cheese or a cereal bowl and a yogurt, but only offering a meat or meat alternate and no grain along with that would not be in compliance. But the student doesn't have to select that grain item in order for the meat and meat alternate to count. So if you offered students a 1 ounce equivalent cereal bowl and a 1 ounce equivalent serving of yogurt, students could select the yogurt as the one item, and they wouldn't necessarily have to select the cereal bowl along with that. And that could look like a reimbursable meal consisting of a meat or meat alternate, a half cup fruit, and a milk. At menu planner discretion, there's also the option to do something called splitting for larger items. So larger items that credit at a higher ounce equivalent, such as a 2 ounce equivalent muffin, could potentially credit as 2 items. And again, this is at the discretion of the menu planner. And you'd need signage to still indicate what constitutes a reimbursable meal. And when we come out to do an administrative review, we'd want to see some pretty clear record keeping on this, and we'd want to see that signage that makes that really clear to all the students. So this can be a little tricky, but to provide an example, if the menu for that day offered a muffin that was a 2 ounce equivalent, a cereal bowl that was a 1 ounce equivalent, a half cup of orange slices, a half cup of apple juice, and a milk, there would be a couple options for students to select to take a reimbursable meal. So they could take a muffin and orange slices, the muffin counting as 2, and the orange slices being the 3rd item taken, and also meeting that requirement of the half cup of fruit. Students could also take a cereal bowl, milk, and juice. So there are those 3 items along with that half cup serving of fruit. Students could also take the muffin, orange slices, and milk, that being at least 3 items, and still meeting that minimum half cup fruit offering. Okay, now we're going to turn it over to the audience and test your knowledge. So first, we're looking at, again, a K through 12, and here on the tray we see some pear halves, a half cup of applesauce, and some toast. So we'll go ahead and put up the poll and see what you guys think. Okay, we've got a few more people that haven't voted. This one's a tight race. Okay, we'll go ahead and close this poll and post the results. So most of you said yes, and that is the correct answer. So we'll go ahead and look back at our tray and talk about why this is a reimbursable meal. So here we have 3 items that have been selected, and we have at least a half cup of fruit. So this would meet the requirement for being a reimbursable meal. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next example. So here we have a cup of milk, we've got some grapes, and some peach halves. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll if everybody can vote whether or not they think this is a reimbursable meal. All right, just about everybody's voted, so we'll go ahead and close this one. And we've got the majority of you answering yes, that it is a reimbursable meal, and that is correct. So we'll go back and look at the tray. So here 3 items have been selected, and we have at least a half cup of fruit. So this would constitute a reimbursable meal. All right, let's look at our next tray. So here on this tray, we have some peach halves and milk. We'll go ahead and open up the poll. Folks can vote whether or not you think this is a reimbursable meal. Okay, we'll go ahead and close it. We've got just about everyone voted. We'll share those results. And the majority of you are correct. This is not a reimbursable meal. We'll go ahead and go back to the tray and take a look at why that is. So in looking at this tray, we only have 2 items. So even though we have the half cup of fruit, we haven't met that requirement of at least 3 items being selected by the student. We'll go ahead and look at our next tray. So we're looking at a K through 8, and we've got a cereal bowl, a pear, and a juice box, and that's a half cup juice. We'll go ahead and launch our poll. All right, you guys are getting a lot quicker on the voting. That's great. Got just about everybody having voted, so we'll go ahead and close it. And the majority of you responded that yes, and that is correct. This is a reimbursable meal. So we'll go back and look at the tray and talk about why that is. So on this tray, we do have 3 items selected, and we have at least a half cup fruit. So we've met the requirement of this being a reimbursable meal. Now, if this was in a high school, this would also still be a reimbursable meal. So even at the higher grade group, we've got that 1 ounce equivalent of grain. We've got the 3 items, one of which being the half cup fruit. So this would also be a reimbursable meal in a high school setting. Okay, we'll look at one more tray, and we've got a K through 5 tray here, and we've got a milk, a 1 ounce string cheese, an apple, and a half cup serving of juice. So we'll go ahead and post this poll. Everybody can vote what they think about this meal. All right, we've got just about everybody voted. The majority of you responded that yes, this is a reimbursable meal, and you are correct. So we'll go back and look at this tray. So we've got at least our 3 items selected, and we've got our half-cup fruit minimum. So this is, in fact, a reimbursable meal. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our last example. So here on this tray, we see a 1-cup milk, a muffin, and a yogurt. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll as to whether or not folks think this is a reimbursable meal. We've got just about everybody voted. We'll wait to get a few more in. All right, we're going to go ahead and close this poll. And share the results. So the majority of you responded no, that it's not a reimbursable meal. And you are correct. It's not a reimbursable meal. So we'll go back and look at the tray and talk about why that is. So here we have 3 items, but we don't have that minimum half cup of fruit. So even if the 3 items are there on the tray, they still have to have at least a half cup of fruit. So this wouldn't be a reimbursable meal. Okay, to talk about some resources, USDA in August of 2014 put out an updated offer versus serve guidance document, and we've provided the link of where you can access that. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. There's a lot of fine-grained details on offer versus serve, and they go through a lot of examples and give a great overview of what's allowed and what's not allowed and what constitutes a reimbursable meal. So I'd strongly encourage folks to read that. And then we also have the link up to the guidance and resource page, so folks can just click on those links to access those. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and conclude with any questions you may have, and we're now going to stop the recording as well.